Video title: The Unstoppable God King, How Alexander the Great Conquered the Known World, Part 1. Hook, midnight to 0:45. Slow zoom on a golden Macedonian sun emblem, blood slowly dripping across the rays. October, 336 BC. The ancient capital of Aegae is alive with the roar of a festival. King Philip II, the most powerful man in the Greek world, walks into the theater, flanked by his guards. He is at the height of his glory, poised to launch an invasion of the mighty Persian Empire. But in a heartbeat, history shatters. A trusted bodyguard, Pausanias, lunges from the shadows. A blade flashes. The king of Macedon collapses, his lifeblood staining the stone floor. In the chaotic silence that follows, one man steps forward. He is 20 years old. He has been trained by Aristotle, tempered on the battlefield of Kyrenia, and whispered to by his mother that he is the son of Zeus himself. As the crown of Macedon is placed upon his brow, the world has no idea that the greatest storm in human history has just been unleashed. He will not just lead an army, he will rewrite the map of the world in blood and fire. This is not just the story of a king. This is the birth of a legend. This is Alexander. Introduction, 0:45 to 2:30. To understand the man, we must understand the world he was born into. In the 4th century BC, the Mediterranean was a fractured mosaic of warring city-states and ancient mysteries. To the south, the prestige of Athens and the iron discipline of Sparta were fading shadows of their former selves. To the east, the Achaemenid Persian Empire loomed like a titan, a superpower that stretched from the shores of the Aegean to the edges of India, commanding riches and armies beyond Western comprehension. But in the rugged, mountainous north of Greece, a new power had risen, Macedonia. Long dismissed by the civilized Greeks as semi-barbarians, the Macedonians had been forged into a lethal war machine by Philip II. He created the Sarissa, a terrifying 18-foot pike, and a professional standing army that moved with the precision of a single organism. Yet, Philip's greatest creation was his son. Alexander was a child of two worlds. From his father, he inherited a tactical genius and an indomitable will. From his mother, the enigmatic and fierce Olympias, he inherited a belief in his own divinity and a mystical destiny that transcended the mortal realm. At the age of 13, he was tutored by Aristotle, the greatest mind of antiquity, who filled the young prince's head with the epics of Homer and the philosophy of leadership. Alexander did not just want to rule, he wanted to emulate Achilles. He wanted eternal glory. When Philip was assassinated, the enemies of Macedon circled like vultures. The Greek cities revolted, the northern tribes rose in rebellion, and the Persian king of kings, Darius III, looked on with indifference at what he thought was a boy king struggling to keep a crumbling throne. They were all wrong. What they saw as a crisis, Alexander saw as an opportunity. Within 2 years, he would consolidate his grip on Greece with a ruthlessness that shocked the world, and then, he would turn his eyes toward the east. He would lead 35,000 men against an empire of millions. The journey we are about to embark upon covers over 20,000 miles, dozens of sieges, and battles that defy logic. This is the first half of the most ambitious military campaign in history. Section 1, The Lion's Cub, Education and the Rise to Power. Alexander's journey to greatness began long before the first Persian spear was leveled. It began in the classrooms of Mysa and the stables of Pella. One of the most defining moments of his youth, a story that has survived 2 millennia, is the taming of Bucephalus. A massive, black stallion was brought to Philip's court, but the beast was wild, rearing and striking at anyone who approached. Philip dismissed the horse as useless. But Alexander noticed something the others didn't: the horse was afraid of its own shadow. Stepping forward, the young prince turned the horse toward the sun, blinding it to its flickering shadow. He spoke softly, leapt onto its back, and galloped across the field. Philip, with tears in his eyes, famously told his son, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you. That horse, Bucephalus, would carry Alexander to the edge of the world. But the relationship between father and son was often strained by blood and politics. When Philip married a Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, it threatened Alexander's status as heir. At the wedding feast, a drunken brawl broke out when the bride's uncle insulted Alexander's legitimacy. Alexander threw a cup at him, and when Philip rose to strike his son, the king stumbled, drunk and enraged. Alexander's taunt was biting. Look at the man who is preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, but cannot even cross from one couch to another. The assassination of Philip in 336 BC remains one of history's greatest whodunits. Was it a jilted lover? Was it a Persian plot? Or was it orchestrated by Olympias and Alexander themselves to secure the throne? Regardless of the culprit, Alexander moved with terrifying speed. He immediately executed all potential rivals to the throne. To the north, the Triballians and Illyrians thought the young king was weak. He marched his army over the Balkan mountains and crushed them in a lightning campaign. While he was in the north, a rumor spread through Greece that Alexander had been killed in battle. The city of Thebes, emboldened by Athenian gold, rose in open rebellion. Alexander didn't send a messenger. He marched his army 250 miles in just 14 days. He appeared before the gates of Thebes like a ghost. When the city refused to surrender, he didn't just defeat them, he made them an example. He razed Thebes to the ground, killing 6,000 and enslaving 30,000. Every house was destroyed except for the home of the poet Pindar. The message was sent across the Mediterranean: the boy king was gone. The Lion of Macedon had arrived. With Greece terrified into submission, the path to Asia was finally clear. Section 2, The First Blood, Crossing the Hellespont and Granicus. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander stood on the shores of the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. As his ships approached the Trojan coast, he cast a spear into the soil, claiming all of Asia as won by the spear. This wasn't just a military invasion, it was a crusade. His first stop was the ruins of Troy, where he paid homage at the tomb of his ancestor, Achilles. He swapped his own armor for a sacred shield from the temple of Athena, a shield he believed would protect him in the battles to come. But the Persian Empire was finally waking up. While King Darius III remained in his distant capital of Susa, the local Persian governors, or satraps, gathered their forces. They met Alexander at the Granicus River. The Persian strategy, advised by the Greek mercenary general Memnon of Rhodes, was to use a scorched earth policy, burning crops and retreating to starve Alexander out. But the Persian satraps, arrogant and seeking glory, rejected the plan. They wanted to crush the Macedonian upstart in a single afternoon. The Persians lined the high eastern bank of the river, their cavalry packed tightly along the shore, backed by Greek mercenaries. It was a tactical blunder. Cavalry need space to charge. Here, they were stationary targets. Alexander's senior general, the veteran Parmenion, urged caution, suggesting they wait until dawn to cross. Alexander refused. "I should be ashamed," he said, "if after crossing the Hellespont, I should be detained by a miserable stream." Alexander led the charge himself. Clad in magnificent armor with a towering white plume on his helmet, he was the primary target. He plunged into the cold, rushing water of the Granicus, his companion cavalry following in a wedge formation. The battle was a chaotic, muddy slaughter. As Alexander climbed the muddy bank, he was surrounded. A Persian noble, Mithridates, struck Alexander's helmet with a mace, shattering it. As another Persian, Spithridates, raised his scimitar for the killing blow, Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's captains, severed the Persian's arm mid-swing, saving the king's life. The Macedonian phalanx followed behind, their long pikes creating a wall of death that the Persian cavalry could not penetrate. The Persian line broke. In his rage and adrenaline, Alexander turned his fury on the Greek mercenaries fighting for Persia, viewing them as traitors to the Hellenic cause. He refused their surrender and slaughtered nearly 2,000 of them. The victory at Granicus was a shockwave. The invincible Persian army had been beaten on its own soil. The gates to Asia Minor were now kicked wide open. Section 3, The Gordian Knot and the Shadow of the Great King. Following the victory at Granicus, Alexander swept through the coastal cities of Ionia, presenting himself not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian tyranny. Most cities, like Ephesus, opened their gates without a fight. But the campaign was not just about battles, it was about the psychology of leadership. In the winter of 333 BC, Alexander's army arrived in the city of Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia. In the citadel sat a legendary relic, an ancient chariot tied to a pole with an incredibly intricate knot made of cornel bark. A prophecy stated that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would become the lord of all Asia. For centuries, many had tried, all had failed. Alexander stood before the knot as a crowd of soldiers and locals watched in silence. He fumbled with the ends for a moment, finding no beginning and no end. But Alexander was not a man to be defeated by a puzzle. In a moment of characteristic decisiveness, he drew his sword and, with a single violent stroke, hacked the knot in half. Or, as some accounts suggest, he simply pulled the linchpin out of the yoke, causing the knot to fall apart. Either way, the message was clear: Alexander would not follow the rules of the old world, he would break them. That night, a thunderstorm rolled over Gordium, which the Macedonians interpreted as Zeus's approval of the solution. While Alexander played the role of the prophesied king, Darius III was finally taking him seriously. The Persian king of kings had mobilized the full might of the empire. He didn't just bring soldiers, he brought a moving city. His baggage train included his mother, his wife, his children, and a treasury of gold. Darius believed in the sheer weight of numbers. He moved his massive army, estimated by ancient sources at 600,000 men, though modern historians suggest a more realistic 100,000, to the plains of northern Syria. Alexander was moving south, through the narrow mountain passes known as the Cilician Gates. He was ill for a time with a violent fever, caught after bathing in the ice-cold Cydnus River. While he recovered, Darius outmaneuvered him, slipping behind the Macedonian army to cut off their supply lines. Alexander was trapped. If he lost the next battle, there would be no retreat, no reinforcements, and no escape. The stage was set for the Battle of Issus, the first time Alexander would look into the eyes of the man whose empire he intended to steal. Section 4, The Battle of Issus, a Clash of Two Worlds. The Battle of Issus, fought in November 333 BC, was a masterpiece of tactical adaptation. The terrain favored Alexander. The battlefield was a narrow strip of land sandwiched between the Amanus Mountains and the Mediterranean Sea. Darius's massive numerical advantage was neutralized, he couldn't outflank Alexander because there was no room to maneuver. The Persian army was cramped, their ranks so deep they were tripping over one another. Darius sat in his magnificent war chariot at the center of his line, surrounded by the Immortals, his elite royal guard. Alexander, as always, took his position on the right wing with his companion cavalry. He saw the Persian line and identified the weakness, the gap between the Persian center and their left wing. The battle began with a roar. The Macedonian phalanx crossed the Panaris River, struggling against the steep banks and the hail of Persian arrows. In the center, the line almost buckled as Persian mercenaries pushed back. But on the right, Alexander was a whirlwind. He led a thunderous cavalry charge that smashed through the Persian left, scattering their archers. Instead of chasing the fleeing troops, Alexander wheeled his cavalry inward, aiming directly for the heart of the Persian army, Darius himself. As Alexander hacked his way toward the royal chariot, Darius panicked. He saw the madman of Macedon, covered in blood and dust, closing in. When his chariot horses were wounded and his drivers killed, Darius lost his nerve. He leaped onto a fresh horse and fled the field, leaving his army, his dignity, and his family behind. The sight of their king fleeing caused the Persian army to collapse into a chaotic rout. Thousands were trampled to death in the narrow passes. But the true shock came when Alexander entered the abandoned Persian camp. There, he found the royal family, Darius's mother, Sisygambes, and his wife and children. They expected to be executed or worse. Instead, Alexander treated them with the respect due to royalty, famously telling Sisygambes that he had no personal quarrel with Darius, he was simply fighting for the right to rule Asia. This act of magnanimity was a brilliant political move. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was a replacement king. Darius sent a letter offering half his empire and his daughter's hand in marriage for the return of his family. Alexander's reply was cold, "I am the king of Asia. If you want anything from me, come and ask for it as a subject." Section 5, The Master of the Sea, the Siege of Tyre and Egypt. With Darius in retreat, Alexander turned his attention south. He could not march into the heart of Persia while the Persian navy still controlled the Mediterranean. He needed to neutralize their bases. Most Phoenician cities surrendered, but the island city of Tyre refused. Tyre was considered impregnable. It sat on an island half a mile off the coast, protected by massive walls that rose directly out of the sea. They laughed at Alexander, believing he had no fleet to reach them. They were wrong. Alexander decided that if he couldn't reach the island by sea, he would bring the land to the island. He ordered the construction of a massive mole, a land bridge made of stones, timber, and dirt. The siege of Tyre lasted 7 grueling months. The Tyrians fought with desperate ingenuity, sending fire ships to burn Alexander's siege towers and using fishing nets to drag Macedonian soldiers off the mole into the sea. Alexander was forced to gather his own fleet from conquered cities to blockade the island. When the walls were finally breached in July 332 BC, the slaughter was horrific. Alexander, enraged by the Tyrians' defiance and their execution of Macedonian prisoners on the walls, ordered the city destroyed. 8,000 Tyrians were killed in the sack, and 30,000 were sold into slavery. The invincible island city was now a graveyard. From Tyre, Alexander marched to Gaza, the last stronghold before Egypt. Despite a wound to his shoulder, he took the city after a 3-month siege. Now, the way to Egypt was open. The Egyptians, who had spent centuries under the thumb of Persian rule, welcomed Alexander as a liberator. They didn't just give him a crown, they gave him a godhead. In Memphis, Alexander was crowned pharaoh, taking on the ancient titles of the son of Ra, and beloved of Ammonius. But Alexander wanted more than a title. He took a small party and trekked deep into the blistering heat of the Sahara Desert to the Siwa oasis, the home of the oracle of Ammonius. The journey was nearly fatal, but legend says that crows and rain guided them through the shifting sands. When he reached the temple, the high priest greeted him with a slip of the tongue, or a divine revelation, calling him Pi Dios, Son of God. Alexander emerged from the temple changed. He never revealed what the oracle told him, but from that day forward, his belief in his own divinity became the driving force of his life. Before leaving Egypt, he stood on a strip of land between Lake Mareotis and the Mediterranean and traced the outlines of a new city in the sand with flour. It would be the greatest of the many cities he would name after himself, Alexandria. He had secured the Mediterranean. He had been declared a god. But the heart of the Persian Empire, Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, still lay ahead. And Darius was waiting, gathering an army the likes of which the world had never seen, on the plains of Gaugamela. Part 1 ends as the God King prepares to cross the Euphrates, heading toward the final showdown that will decide the fate of the world. Section 6, The Shadow of the Great King, the Death of Darius and the Rise of a New Pharaoh. By the summer of 330 BCE, Alexander was no longer merely a king of Macedon or a hegemon of the Greeks, he was the master of the Persian heartland. Yet, as long as Darius III remained alive and at large, Alexander's legitimacy was incomplete. The pursuit of the fallen great king became an obsession that drove the Macedonian army deep into the Iranian plateau. Leaving the scorched ruins of Persepolis behind, Alexander pushed his men through the Caspian gates in a forced march of staggering intensity. He learned that Darius had been taken prisoner by his own satrap, Bessus, the governor of Bactria. Bessus sought to use the king as a bargaining chip, but as Alexander's cavalry closed the distance, the desperate satraps panicked. Near the modern city of Sharad, they stabbed Darius and left him to bleed out in a wagon. By the time Alexander arrived, the man who once ruled the known world was dead. The sight of Darius's body triggered a profound shift in Alexander. Rather than celebrating the death of his rival, he covered the corpse with his own royal cloak. In a masterstroke of political theater, Alexander cast himself not as the destroyer of the Achaemenids, but as their rightful successor and avenger. He sent Darius's body to Persepolis for a royal burial and declared himself the Lord of Asia. This transition, however, required more than just a title, it required the adoption of Persian court ritual. Alexander began wearing a mix of Macedonian and Persian clothing and, most controversially, attempted to introduce the practice of proskynesis, the traditional Persian act of bowing or prostrating oneself before the monarch. To the Persians, this was a sign of social rank. To the Greeks and Macedonians, it was an act reserved for the gods. This cultural synthesis sparked a simmering resentment among his veteran officers. Men like Philotas and his father Parmenion, who had served Philip II, viewed these changes as a betrayal of Macedonian tradition. The tension reached a breaking point in late 330 BCE when a conspiracy against Alexander's life was uncovered. Whether Philotas was truly involved or merely failed to report it, Alexander used the opportunity to purge the old guard. Philotas was executed after a trial by the army, and a secret order was sent to Ecbatana to assassinate the elder Parmenion before he could rebel. This ruthless consolidation of power signaled that the old partnership between the king and his nobility was dead. Alexander was now a lone autocrat, a divine monarch who stood above his peers, answerable to no one but the gods he claimed as kin. Section 7, To the Ends of the Earth, the brutal war in Bactria and Sogdiana. The campaign now moved into the rugged, unforgiving frontiers of Central Asia, modern-day Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. From 329 to 327 BCE, Alexander faced a type of warfare his phalanx was never designed for, a widespread, decentralized insurgency. Bessus, having declared himself Artaxerxes V, was eventually captured, mutilated according to Persian law, and executed, but his death did not end the resistance. A charismatic Sogdian warlord named Spitamenes rose to lead a guerrilla campaign that bled the Macedonian forces. Here, in the freezing mountain passes of the Hindu Kush and the blistering deserts of the Oxus River, the war turned exceptionally cruel. Alexander responded to the hit-and-run tactics of the Sogdians by razed cities and deporting entire populations, a stark departure from the relative leniency he had shown in Asia Minor. The climax of this mountain war took place at the Sogdian Rock in 327 BCE. The fortress was deemed impregnable, perched on a sheer cliff face. When Alexander demanded their surrender, the defenders mockingly told him he would need soldiers with wings to take the heights. Alexander called for volunteers among his best climbers, offering massive rewards for the first to reach the top. Using iron tent pegs and flaxen ropes, 300 men scaled the frozen precipice under the cover of night. When the sun rose, the defenders saw the Macedonians waving flags above them and surrendered in terror. Among the captives was Roxana, the daughter of the local noble Oxyarchs. Captivated by her beauty, or perhaps seeking a political alliance to stabilize the region, Alexander married her. It was a union that scandalized his generals but signaled his intent to rule as an eastern potentate. Yet, the psychological toll of the campaign was mounting. In the city of Maracanda, during a night of heavy drinking, a heated argument broke out between Alexander and Clitus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. Clitus accused Alexander of erasing his father Philip's legacy and pandering to barbarians. Enraged and intoxicated, Alexander snatched a spear from a guard and run Clitus through, killing him instantly. The immediate remorse was shattering. Alexander wept for 3 days, refusing to eat. This incident highlighted the growing instability of a king who was increasingly isolated by his own greatness. He had conquered the mountains, but the internal divide between his Macedonian roots and his Asian empire was a chasm that no amount of blood could bridge. Section 8, The Storm Across the Indus, The Battle of the Hydaspes. Driven by a desire to reach the outer ocean that Greek geographers believed encircled the world, Alexander turned his gaze toward India in 326 BCE. After crossing the Khyber Pass and subduing the fierce tribes of the Swat Valley, he reached the banks of the Hydaspes River. There, he faced King Porus, a towering monarch who commanded a massive army featuring an element the Macedonians dreaded, 200 war elephants. The river was swollen by the monsoon rains, making a direct crossing impossible. Alexander engaged in a weeks-long campaign of deception, moving his troops up and down the bank to tire the Indians and mask his true intentions. Under the cover of a violent thunderstorm, Alexander led a contingent of 15,000 men and 5,000 cavalry across the river at a hidden bend, catching Porus by surprise. The Battle of the Hydaspes was the most costly and grueling of Alexander's career. The Macedonian phalanx had to contend with the living fortresses of the elephants, which trampled men and used their trunks to hurl soldiers into the air. The carnage was horrific. Alexander's light infantry used axes and scythes to hamstrung the beasts, while archers targeted the mahouts. Eventually, the wounded elephants panicked, trampling their own Indian ranks. Porus fought with legendary bravery until he was covered in wounds. When he was finally brought before Alexander and asked how he wished to be treated, Porus replied, like a king. Impressed by his dignity, Alexander restored Porus to his throne and expanded his territory, turning a former enemy into a loyal ally. The victory, however, was bittersweet. It was here that Bucephalus, Alexander's beloved horse and companion of 20 years, died of his wounds or old age. Alexander founded the city of Bucephala in the horse's honor. Despite the triumph, the soldiers were reaching their breaking point. They had marched over 11,000 miles, endured tropical diseases, and survived the most terrifying battle of their lives. They were hearing rumors of even greater empires to the east, the Nanda Empire, with thousands more elephants and hundreds of thousands of infantry. The physical environment was also a foe. The relentless Indian monsoon had soaked their gear, rotted their clothes, and filled their boots with mud for 70 days straight. The invincible army was beginning to fray at the seams. Section 9, The Breaking Point, Mutiny and the Return through the Gadrosian Waste. In late 326 BCE, at the banks of the Hyphasis River, the inevitable happened. The Macedonian army went on strike. Alexander, ever the visionary, gave a stirring speech urging them to push on to the Ganges and the Eastern Ocean, promising them the riches of the world. But the men remained silent. Finally, Caenis, one of his most loyal commanders, spoke for the rank and file. He told the king that, a noble thing is to know when to stop. He spoke of parents who would never see their sons again and soldiers whose armor was worn thin and whose spirits were broken. Alexander, furious and humiliated, retreated to his tent for 3 days, hoping the men would change their minds. They did not. For the first time in his life, Alexander the Great was forced to retreat. The journey back was not a peaceful withdrawal, it was a bloody trek down the Indus River to the Indian Ocean. Along the way, they encountered the Mali people. During the siege of their capital, Alexander, frustrated by his army's perceived cowardice at the Hyphasis, leaped alone from the battlements into the city. He was struck by an arrow that pierced his lung, nearly killing him. His soldiers, believing their king dead, massacred the population in a frenzied rage. Alexander survived, but the wound would plague him for the rest of his life. Upon reaching the ocean, he split his forces. One part went by sea under Nearchus, while Alexander led the bulk of the army through the Gadrosian Desert in modern-day Pakistan, a decision that remains his greatest logistical failure. The 60-day march through the Gadrosian Desert was a catastrophe that claimed more lives than all his battles combined. The blistering heat, lack of water, and flash floods decimated the camp followers and soldiers alike. In a famous display of leadership, when a soldier brought Alexander a helmet full of water scavenged from a distant spring, the king poured it into the sand in front of his parched troops, declaring that if all could not drink, he would not drink alone. When the remnants of the army finally reached the fertile lands of Carmania, they were a hollowed-out force. Alexander's return was marked by a series of executions of satraps who had governed poorly or rebelled during his long absence in India. The conqueror had returned, but the cost of his ambition was written in the bleached bones of the desert. Section 10, The Twilight of a God, Susa, Babylon, and the Final Breath. By 324 BCE, Alexander was back in Susa, the administrative heart of his empire. He sought to solidify his vision of a unified Greco-Persian world through the Susa weddings. He and 80 of his top officers married noble Persian women in a massive ceremony. Alexander himself took Statira, the daughter of Darius III, as his second wife. He also integrated 30,000 Persian youths, trained in the Macedonian fashion, into his army. This fusion policy led to a final mutiny at Opis, where Macedonian veterans felt replaced by barbarians. Alexander quelled the riot with a masterful speech, reminding them of how his father Philip had found them as poor shepherds and how he had made them masters of the world. The men wept and reconciled, but the cultural rift remained unhealed. The greatest blow to Alexander's psyche came in late 324 BCE with the death of Hephaestion, his closest friend, general, and likely lover. Alexander's grief was pathological. He cut his hair short, crucified the physician who had failed to save him, and banned music throughout the empire. He sent a request to the Siwa oasis to have Hephaestion deified. As he returned to Babylon in 323 BCE to plan new expeditions to Arabia and perhaps the western Mediterranean, he was a man haunted by loss and physical exhaustion. In May, after a night of heavy drinking at a banquet for Nearchus, Alexander fell ill with a fever. For 12 days, his condition worsened. As he lay on his deathbed, unable to speak, his generals were allowed to file past him one by one. He could only acknowledge them with his eyes. When asked to whom he left his empire, Alexander reportedly whispered, "To the strongest, toi Kratistoi*." On June 10 or 11, 323 BCE, at the age of 32, Alexander the Great died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II. The causes remain debated: malaria, typhoid, or perhaps poisoning by the sons of Antipater. His death triggered an immediate collapse of the unity he had forged. His pregnant wife Roxana had his other wives murdered. His generals, the Diadochi, immediately began carving up the empire into warring factions. Alexander's body, preserved in a vat of honey, was hijacked by Ptolemy and taken to Egypt, where it would eventually rest in a magnificent tomb in Alexandria, a city that would become the beacon of the new world he had inadvertently created. Conclusion. The death of Alexander the Great did not end his story, it began a new epoch in human history, the Hellenistic Age. For 3 centuries after his passing, the Greek language became the lingua franca of the civilized world, from the Mediterranean to the Himalayas. The cities he founded, nearly 70 of them named Alexandria, became hubs of trade, science, and philosophy. The great library of Alexandria in Egypt and the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms in the East served as bridges where the wisdom of the West met the spirituality of the East. Without Alexander, there would be no Rosetta Stone, no widespread dissemination of Aristotelian logic, and perhaps no Roman Empire as we know it, for Rome inherited the Hellenistic world that Alexander built. Alexander's legacy is a complex tapestry of brilliance and brutality. He was a man who slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow, yet he could raze a city to the ground in a fit of pique. He was a visionary who dreamed of a commonwealth of mankind, yet he was a conqueror whose path was paved with the blood of hundreds of thousands. He proved that the sheer force of personality could bend the trajectory of history. He broke the boundaries of the known world, proving that no mountain was too high and no desert too wide for the human spirit. Even today, his name is spoken with reverence in some cultures and as a two-horned devil in others. Why does Alexander still matter? Because his life represents the ultimate human paradox, the desire for immortality through action. He lived more in 32 years than most civilizations do in 1,000. He taught us that the world is not a static place, but something to be shaped, explored, and understood. His story is a warning about the corrupting nature of absolute power, but also a testament to the power of curiosity and courage. As we look at the ruins of his cities and the statues that bear his likeness, we are reminded that while empires inevitably crumble, the ideas and cultural exchanges he unleashed continue to pulse through the veins of modern society. Alexander didn't just conquer the world, he changed its very DNA. Outro. If this journey through history captivated you, make sure you subscribe to Chronicles of History. We publish new documentaries every week. Tell us in the comments below, what do you think was the single most decisive moment in this story? Was it the victory at Gaugamela, the decision to turn back at the Hyphasis, or the death of Hephaestion? Your insights help us bring the past to life. And check out our other videos on screen right now for more epic history. I'm your narrator, and this has been the story of Alexander the Great.